I didn't want to go back. I told myself I wasn't ready. Maybe I'd never be ready. But bills don't pay themselves, and pretending to be normal is what everyone expects after a while. So I went back to work at the hospital. It's not a fancy place. Just a small worn-down building with narrow hallways and a constant hum from the fluorescent lights overhead. The kind of place where the air always smells faintly of disinfectant mixed with something sour you can never quite place. Maybe it's the floor wax, or maybe it's just the smell of sickness and time. Either way, I hated it. When I stepped through the automatic doors that evening, everything hit me at once. The sounds of machines beeping, the quiet chatter of nurses, the occasional echo of a cart being pushed down a hallway. It was all so familiar, but it felt wrong, like I didn't belong there anymore. Or maybe it was the hospital that didn't belong. I tried to shake it off. Just nerves, I told myself. After everything I'd been through, it made sense to feel on edge. But no matter how much I tried to focus on my tasks, checking charts, restocking supplies, doing rounds, I couldn't ignore the way my stomach kept twisting. The air felt heavy, like the whole building was pressing down on me. And the silence. That was the worst part. Hospitals are never completely silent. But somehow this one felt like it was. Even with all the usual noises, there was this oppressive quiet underneath it all, like the place was holding its breath. It reminded me too much of them. The nights after it happened, after they took me, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound would set me off. A creak in the floorboards, the wind brushing against the windows. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, convinced they were coming back, that they were still watching me. That night at the hospital felt just like those nights. Like something was there with me, just out of sight. The hallways seemed darker than I remembered, even with the same dim lighting they always had. The shadows stretched too far, clinging to the corners like they were alive. Every time I turned a corner, I'd feel a chill run up my back, like someone was standing right behind me. But every time I looked, the hall was empty. I told myself I was being paranoid. It wasn't the first time I'd felt that way since the abduction. It was like my brain had rewired itself to be on high alert all the time, constantly looking for danger that might not even be there. But it didn't stop the feeling from creeping in. Around midnight, I was walking through one of the older wings of the hospital, the part they barely used anymore. It was quieter there, colder too. The air felt stale, like the ventilation didn't reach that far. As I walked, I noticed something odd. The sound of my footsteps didn't echo the way they should have. In those empty hallways, the sound always bounced off the walls. But now, it was like the noise just stopped, like the walls were absorbing it. That's when I started to feel it. The heaviness. Not just the air, but something deeper, pressing down on me from the inside out. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get a full breath. And then, out of nowhere, I felt it. A sensation I hadn't felt since the night I was taken. It's hard to describe, but it's like you're being watched, except it's not just your skin that feels it. It's your mind. Like there's something staring straight into your thoughts, peeling back every layer, and you can't stop it. That's how it felt. I froze in the middle of the hallway, too scared to move, too scared to breathe. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I'd pass out. I kept telling myself to turn around, to go back, but I couldn't. It was like my feet were glued to the floor. When I finally managed to take a step, the sound of my shoe against the tile was deafening. It echoed in my head, even though it shouldn't have. I walked as fast as I could without breaking into a full sprint, praying I'd see someone, anyone, around the next corner. But the halls were empty, and the shadows seemed darker than ever. That was the moment I realized something was different. This wasn't just paranoia or leftover trauma from what happened to me. The hospital wasn't just a place anymore. It was something else, something alive, and it had noticed me. Did you enjoy the start of this story? Got any thoughts or questions? Drop your comment below. I'd love to hear what you think so far. And if you'd like to support the channel so I can keep bringing stories like this, consider donating any amount. The link is pinned in the first comment. Even the smallest help makes a huge difference. Thank you for being here. I had barely calmed down when my pager buzzed. The screen lit up with a room number, 207. I was needed. The small jolt of adrenaline helped me shake off the lingering fear, but only a little. I remember taking a deep breath and telling myself to focus. "This is your job," I whispered under my breath. Room 207 was in the general ward, a part of the hospital that was less eerie than the older wings. Still, the walk there felt longer than it should have been. Every step felt heavy, like I was wading through water. When I entered, the room smelled faintly of antiseptic and sweat, the way most hospital rooms do. The patient, a man in his 70s, was lying there, pale and motionless. His skin had that waxy look people get when they're near the end. I didn't recognize him, but that wasn't surprising. There were too many patients for me to know them all. His chart was clipped to the foot of the bed. I picked it up, scanning through the details. Terminal cancer, late stage. His body was shutting down, organs failing one by one. "Mr. Jameson," I said softly, not really expecting a response. He didn't move. His breathing was shallow, barely audible over the sound of the machines monitoring his vitals. I glanced around the room. It was empty except for the usual equipment, the IV stand, the heart monitor, and the cold, sterile furniture that always seemed out of place in a room where people were dying. Something about the space felt off. The corners of the room seemed darker than they should have been, like the shadows were thicker there. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on the task at hand. I adjusted his IV and checked the tubing to make sure everything was running smoothly. As I worked, I couldn't help but notice how quiet the machines were. The beeping of the heart monitor seemed slower, duller, like it was fading. When I looked at him again, his eyes were open, wide open. It startled me. I hadn't heard him move, hadn't noticed him waking up. For a moment, I just stared at him, frozen. His eyes were cloudy, almost gray, and they seemed to be looking past me at something just over my shoulder. "Mr. Jameson?" I said again, my voice shaky. He didn't respond. His lips moved, but no sound came out. It was like he was trying to say something, but the effort was too much. I leaned closer, straining to hear, and that's when I felt it again. That same oppressive presence from before, like the air was pushing down on me. My chest felt tight, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wanted to turn around to see if there was something behind me, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I focused on him. His lips kept moving, forming words I couldn't understand. His eyes were fixed on the space behind me, and the longer I watched, the more it felt like he wasn't looking at something. He was looking at someone. My instincts told me to get out of that room. I finished my checks as quickly as I could, then stepped back toward the door. As I reached for the handle, the heart monitor let out a long, flat tone. I turned back, expecting to see him still and lifeless. But he wasn't there. The bed was empty. The sheets were crumpled, and his hospital gown was lying on the mattress, like he'd slipped out of it without moving. I froze, my brain scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't make any sense. Patients don't just disappear. Even if he'd gotten out of bed, the machines would have gone with him. The IV stand was still in place, the tubing still connected to nothing. I backed out of the room slowly, my heart racing. My mind was screaming at me to report what had happened, but I couldn't move. I stood in the hallway staring at the door to 207, waiting for something, anything to explain what I'd just seen. But nothing happened. When I finally managed to pull myself together, I realized I couldn't tell anyone. How could I? What would I even say? That a patient had vanished into thin air? They'd think I was crazy. Maybe I was. As I walked back to the nurse's station, my legs felt like jelly. I kept expecting someone to stop me, to ask what had happened, but no one did. No one even looked at me. The rest of the night passed, in a blur, but I couldn't shake the image of that empty bed and those crumpled sheets. By the time my shift ended, I wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that Mr. Jameson had disappeared, or the fact that no one else seemed to notice he was gone. When I left the hospital that morning, I thought maybe my mind had finally cracked. I didn't even tell anyone about it. What would I say? That a man disappeared into thin air? That I felt some kind of presence watching me while it happened? They'd think I lost it, and maybe I had. The whole day I tried to push it out of my head. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that empty bed again. The crumpled hospital gown, the way the machines were still connected to nothing. It didn't make sense. It wasn't possible. When my next shift came, I almost called in sick. The thought of walking back into that hospital made my chest tighten. But I couldn't avoid it forever. I needed the paycheck, and honestly, a part of me wanted answers. The first few hours of my shift were uneventful. I stayed busy, trying to drown out the memories of the night before. I didn't go anywhere near room 207. Just the thought of it made my stomach twist. It wasn't until around 2 a.m. that I noticed something strange. One of the patients in the ICU, an older woman named Mrs. Green, started acting differently. She had been admitted earlier that evening with severe pneumonia, and her condition had been critical but stable. I hadn't interacted with her much, but I remembered the way she had smiled faintly when I adjusted her blankets earlier in the night. Now, as I glanced at her from the nurse's station, something about her seemed off. Her head was tilted to the side, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. At first I thought she had passed away, but then I saw her lips moving, whispering something I couldn't hear. I walked over to her room, my footsteps echoing softly in the quiet hallway. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt. By the time I stepped inside, it was like the entire room was weighed down by something invisible. "Mrs. Green," I said softly. She didn't respond. Her eyes stayed locked on the ceiling, her lips moving in a steady rhythm. I leaned in closer, trying to make out what she was saying. At first it sounded like nonsense, just random syllables strung together. But the more I listened, the more it started to sound familiar. Not like a language I recognized, but like something I'd heard before, in a dream or a nightmare. A chill ran down my spine. "Mrs. Green," I tried again, louder this time. "Can you hear me?" Her lips stopped moving. Her eyes flicked toward me, and for a moment, I felt like she was looking straight through me. Then she smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. There was something wrong about it. something too wide, too knowing. I stepped back instinctively, my heart pounding in my chest. The heart monitor beeped once, then twice, before letting out a long, flat tone. I froze, staring at the screen. Her heart had stopped. I grabbed the crash cart, my hands trembling as I pulled it into the room. I didn't even have time to call for help. My training kicked in and I started CPR, pressing down on her chest with everything I had. But something was wrong. Her body didn't feel right. It was lighter, almost hollow, like I was pushing on a balloon instead of a person. And then, just like before, it happened. The room went cold, and the shadows in the corners seemed to grow darker, deeper. The air felt heavy, like it was being sucked out of the room. I stopped compressions, my hands hovering over her chest. I don't know why I stopped. It was like some part of me knew it was pointless. I looked down at her, and for a split second, I thought I saw her eyes move. Not toward me, but past me, toward the ceiling. And then she was gone. One moment she was lying there, pale and lifeless. The next, the bed was empty. The blankets were still there, crumpled up. And her hospital gown was folded neatly on the mattress, just like Mr. Jameson's had been. I stumbled back, my legs barely holding me up. The crash cart tipped over, sending supplies clattering to the floor. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. 2 patients, 2 disappearances. And both times I had felt that same presence, that same crushing heaviness in the air. I backed out of the room, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the door handle. When I looked up, one of the other nurses was standing at the end of the hallway, staring at me. "What happened?" she asked, her voice calm but curious. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could I say? That Mrs. Green had vanished? That I felt like the hospital was swallowing people whole? I don't know. I finally managed to stammer. She frowned, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Do you need a break? You look pale." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She gave me a concerned look before walking past me into the room. I didn't wait to see what she'd find, or not find. I just walked away, my heart pounding in my chest. I spent the rest of the By the time I got home, the sun was already creeping over the horizon, its light spilling through the cracks in my blinds. But instead of feeling relief, the usual sense of I made it through another shift wasn't there. I sat at the edge of my bed, still in my scrubs, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. I knew I had to tell someone. I knew that what I had witnessed twice now wasn't normal, wasn't something I could just ignore. But the words felt stuck in my throat, heavy and impossible to say. Who was I supposed to tell? My supervisor? The other nurses? And what would I even say? That 2 patients had vanished into thin air under my watch? That I'd felt something. In the room with me both times. The words sounded insane, even in my own head. And there was something else. Something I couldn't shake. If I reported it, people would ask questions. They'd start looking at me, scrutinizing me, wondering if I'd made it up or if I was responsible somehow. After all, I was the common thread between both disappearances. What if they thought I had done something to those patients? The thought made my stomach churn. I could already imagine the sideways glances, the whispered conversations in the break room. The hospital wasn't kind to people who stood out, and I didn't want to give anyone a reason to see me as a problem. but keeping it to myself felt just as bad. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. Mr. Jameson's wide, staring eyes and Mrs. Green's eerie, too wide smile. And I couldn't stop thinking about the way their hospital gowns had been left behind, folded and empty, like they'd just evaporated. I thought about calling a friend, someone outside of work, just to talk it through. But what was I supposed to say? Hey, do you believe people can disappear into thin air? Because I just watched it happen. It sounded ridiculous. So I sat there, staring at my phone, scrolling mindlessly through my contacts, and doing nothing. The rest of the day passed in a fog. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every little noise in my apartment made me jump. A car horn outside, the creak of the floorboards, even the sound of my own breathing. By the time I had to head back to the hospital for my next shift, I felt like I was walking into a nightmare. My palms were slick with sweat as I clocked in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching me. But the truth was, no one even noticed. The nurses were busy with their rounds, the doctors were rushing from one room to the next, and no one even looked up as I walked past. For a moment, I felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe no one had realized what had happened. Maybe they just chalked it up to a mistake in the paperwork or a transfer that wasn't logged properly. Maybe I could get through the night without anyone asking questions, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the end of it. As the hours ticked by, I found myself avoiding certain areas of the hospital. I didn't go near room 207, and I stayed far away from the ICU. Instead, I busied myself with small tasks, stocking supplies, checking vitals, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time I passed an empty hallway, I felt like I was being watched. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see something, or someone, waiting for me. At one point, I caught myself staring at a patient's chart, reading the same line over and over without actually processing it. My hands were trembling, and I felt like I couldn't catch my breath. "Get it together," I whispered to myself, clenching my fists to stop the shaking. But the words didn't help. By the end of the shift, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. As I walked out of the hospital, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. I was glad to be out of that place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was taking something with me, something I couldn't see or explain. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to say anything, not yet at least. I needed more information, more proof. Because as much as I wanted to believe I was imagining things, I couldn't ignore what I'd seen. People were disappearing, and I had a terrible feeling that whatever was happening wasn't over. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going like this. By the time my next shift rolled around, I felt like a shell of myself. The lack of sleep was catching up to me, and every time I closed my eyes, I'd see those empty beds again. It was like my brain couldn't let it go, replaying the scenes over and over until they felt burned into my skull. But that night, something was different. The hospital had always been unsettling, especially during the late night shifts when the hallways felt too quiet, too still. But this time, it was like the entire building was holding its breath. Even the fluorescent lights seemed dimmer, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just tired. But as the night went on, I started noticing little things that didn't make sense. It started with the monitors. I was in the ICU, checking on a patient, when one of the machines started beeping erratically. At first, I thought it was just a technical glitch, It happens all the time. But when I looked at the monitor, the readings didn't make any sense. The patient's heart rate was bouncing between extremes, going from 30 beats per minute to over 200 in the span of a few seconds. Their oxygen levels were fluctuating wildly, dropping to almost nothing before spiking back to normal. I checked the patient, but they seemed fine, breathing steadily, no signs of distress. It didn't add up. I tried resetting the machine, but the moment I turned it back on, the readings went haywire again. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The monitor went completely blank, the screen flickering for a second before it powered back on as if nothing had happened. I stared at it, my heart racing. I wanted to call for someone, to tell one of the other nurses what I'd seen, but something stopped me. A voice in the back of my head whispered that it wouldn't matter. They wouldn't believe me. And besides, it wasn't just the monitors. As the night went on, I started hearing things. Little noises that didn't belong. A faint hum, like the sound of electricity running through a wire, except it wasn't coming from the machines. It was coming from somewhere else. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway behind me. But when I turned around, there was no one. There. Just the empty corridor stretching out into darkness. The worst part, though, was the shadows. I'd always hated the way the hospital's lights made everything look unnatural, with sharp, jagged edges that seemed to move when you weren't looking. But that night, the shadows felt different. They weren't just dark spots on the walls or the floor. They had weight to them, like they were pressing in on the edges of my vision. More than once I thought I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of motion just at the edge of the light. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. By the time my shift was halfway over, I felt like I was losing my mind. I kept telling myself it was just paranoia, just my exhaustion, playing tricks on me. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. Something was wrong. When the next patient was wheeled in, I felt my stomach twist. I was in the ICU again, and this time, the patient was a man in his early 60s. His name was Mr. Davis, and he'd been admitted after suffering a massive stroke. He was completely unresponsive, hooked up to more machines than I could count, and his prognosis wasn't good. Normally, I'd have felt a pang of sadness. It's hard not to, working in a place like this, watching people cling to life with every ounce of strength they have. But with Mr. Davis, all I felt was dread. The room they placed him in was too familiar. 2 doors down from where Mrs. Green had disappeared, close enough that I could still feel the weight of what had happened there. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Patients got shuffled around all the time, and the ICU only had so many rooms. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. I spent most of the night avoiding his room. I busied myself with other patients, checking vitals, refilling IVs, anything to keep myself occupied. But every time I walked past his door, I felt it. That same heaviness in the air, like the room was alive. Around 3 a.m., I finally gave in. My rounds required me to check on him, and I couldn't put it off any longer. I grabbed his chart and walked to his room, my heart pounding with every step. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The air was colder than it should have been, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, deeper. The monitors beeped steadily, but the sound felt muffled, like it was coming from far away. Mr. Davis was lying on the bed, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the ventilator. His face was slack, his eyes closed. He looked so small, so fragile, like he could disappear at any moment. I checked his vitals, trying to focus on the numbers instead of the gnawing fear in the back of my mind. Everything seemed normal. His heart rate, his oxygen levels, even the readings on the EEG were stable. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. His hand twitched. It was just a small movement, barely noticeable, but it stopped me in my tracks. I turned back to him, watching closely. His hand twitched again, this time curling slightly into a fist before relaxing. "Mr. Davis?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I knew it was pointless. His brain activity was minimal, and even if he could hear me, there was no way he could respond. But something about the way his hand moved made my skin crawl. And then, his eyes opened. I gasped, taking a step back. His eyes were cloudy, unfocused, staring straight ahead. But just like Mrs. Green, it didn't feel like he was looking at the ceiling. It felt like he was looking at something above him. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I stepped closer, leaning in to catch what he was saying. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language I recognized. The sounds were guttural, alien, like something no human mouth should have been able to produce. "Mr. Davis?" I tried, again, my voice trembling. "Can you hear me?" His head tilted slightly, and for a moment I thought he was looking at me. But then his gaze shifted, his eyes locking onto the corner of the room. I froze, my chest tightening as I followed his gaze. There was nothing there. Just the same dark, empty corner I'd seen 100 times before. But the way he was staring at it, it was like he could see something I couldn't. The heart monitor let out a sharp beep, snapping me out of my trance. I looked back at him, and my stomach dropped. His vitals were plummeting. I scrambled to adjust the settings on the ventilator, my hands shaking as I tried to stabilize him. But no matter what I did, the numbers kept dropping. His oxygen levels fell to 0, the heart monitor flatlined, and the EEG showed no brain activity. And then, just like before, he was gone. The bed was empty. His hospital gown and the sheets were crumpled, just like the others. The machines were still running, the tubes still connected to nothing. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My head was spinning, my mind struggling to process what I'd just seen. 3 patients, 3 disappearances. I knew I couldn't keep pretending this was normal. Something was happening in that hospital, something I couldn't explain. And I was terrified that whatever it wasn't done yet. By this point, I was done pretending things were normal. 3 patients had vanished without a trace, and I was the only one who seemed to notice. The hospital kept moving like nothing had happened. New patients were admitted, rounds continued, and no one seemed the slightest bit concerned. I kept telling myself to speak up, to tell someone what I'd seen. But every time I thought about it, I hesitated. What if they didn't believe me? Worse, what if they did believe me and started asking questions I couldn't answer? Instead, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I needed to see it happen. I needed proof. So, on my next shift, I volunteered to cover the overnight watch. It wasn't unusual. ICU night shifts were hard to fill, and I'd taken them before. But this time, I had a purpose. I wanted to be there when it happened again. The hours passed, slowly. Midnight came and went, and nothing out of the ordinary happened. I tried to stay busy, checking charts and adjusting IVs, but my mind kept wandering back to the empty beds, the crumpled sheets, the way each patient had vanished right in front of me. By 2 a.m., I was starting to doubt myself. Maybe it wouldn't happen again. Maybe whatever this was had run its course. Or maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, and my brain was just looking for patterns where there weren't any. But then something changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, like the atmosphere in the hospital had thickened. The lights overhead seemed dimmer, their usual flickering more pronounced. And the hum of the machines in the ICU? It was quieter, almost like it was fading into the background. I stopped what I was doing, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood there for a moment, listening, waiting for something to happen. And then I heard it, a low, faint hum, like the sound of electricity buzzing through a wire. But it wasn't coming from the machines. It was coming from one of the patient rooms, room 212. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts screaming at me to turn around, to walk away, to leave. But I couldn't. If I wanted answers, I had to see it for myself. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing softly in the silence. The closer I got to the room, the louder the hum became. It wasn't just a sound. It was a vibration, like it was coming from inside my chest. When I reached the door, I stopped. The room was dark, the only light coming from the monitors next to the patient's bed. I stepped inside, my hands trembling. As I reached for the light switch, the fluorescent bulb flickered to life, casting harsh shadows across the room. The patient, a man in his 50s named Mr. Alvarez, was lying still on the bed, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. I looked around the room trying to pinpoint the source of the hum, but it seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then, the monitors started beeping. At first it was just a single beep, sharp and piercing, cutting through the silence. But then another joined it, and another, until the room was filled with a chaotic symphony of alarms. I rushed to his bedside, my hands moving automatically as I checked the equipment. His heart rate was spiking, his oxygen levels dropping rapidly. "Mr. Alvarez," I said, my voice trembling. "Can you hear me?" His eyes snapped open and I froze. He was staring straight at me, but his eyes weren't normal. They were completely black. No whites, no irises, just endless empty voids. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. He opened his mouth, but the sound that came out wasn't human. It was a low, guttural growl, layered with something higher pitched, like static. The room went cold and the hum grew louder, vibrating through my entire body. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, stretching toward the bed. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, watching helplessly as the shadows wrapped around Mr. Alvarez like tendrils. And then, just like the others, he was gone. The bed was empty, the sheets crumpled, and his hospital gown was lying neatly on the mattress. The humming stopped. The room was silent again, the only sound the faint buzz of the fluorescent light overhead. I backed out of the room, my heart racing, my mind struggling to comprehend what I'd just seen. 4 patients, 4 disappearances. And now I had no doubt, whatever was happening in that hospital, it was getting worse. I didn't sleep after that shift. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mr. Alvarez's face, those black, empty eyes staring back at me, and the way the shadows had seemed alive, pulling him into nothingness. By the time my next shift started, I was running on fumes. My hands were shaky, my head foggy, and every sound made me flinch. But despite how exhausted I felt, there was no way I could stay home. Not after what I'd seen. I needed answers. The first few hours of the shift passed uneventfully, which somehow made things worse. The quiet felt heavy, like the hospital was waiting for something to happen. Even the other nurses seemed tense, though I couldn't tell if it was just my paranoia making me project my feelings onto them. I spent most of the night avoiding the ICU, sticking to the general ward where things felt less oppressive. But around 1 a.m., my pager buzzed. Room 215. My stomach dropped. That was another room in the ICU, not far from where Mr. Alvarez had disappeared. For a moment I debated pretending I hadn't seen the page. Maybe someone else would handle it. But I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. When I got to the room, I hesitated at the door. The patient, Mrs. Crawford, was a woman in her 80s who'd been admitted for complications from advanced COPD. She'd been stable the last time I'd checked her chart, but the page indicated a sudden drop in oxygen levels. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the cold. It wasn't just a slight chill, it was the kind of cold that cuts straight to your bones, making your breath puff out in white clouds. Mrs. Crawford was lying on the bed, her body unnaturally still. Her chest wasn't rising and falling the way it should have been, and her lips were a bluish gray. For a moment I thought she was already gone, but then her eyes opened. They weren't like Mr. Alvarez's. There was no black void, no unnatural emptiness. But there was something else, something wrong. Her pupils were blown wide, almost completely eclipsing the whites of her eyes, and she was staring at the ceiling with a look of pure terror. "Mrs. Crawford," I said, my voice barely. Above a whisper, she didn't respond. Her mouth opened slightly, and a thin, raspy sound escaped her lips. It wasn't quite a word, but it sounded like she was trying to say something. I stepped closer, leaning in to hear her better, and then she screamed. It was the kind of scream that doesn't seem possible for a human being to make, high-pitched and raw, like the sound was being ripped out of her. My ears rang and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the IV stand. The machines around her started going haywire. The heart monitor let out a deafening series of beeps, and the ventilator alarmed as her oxygen levels plummeted. I should have called for help. I should have hit the emergency button or paged a doctor, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at her as she arched her back off the bed, her body convulsing like a puppet on strings. And then it stopped. Her body went limp, collapsing back onto the mattress. The machines fell silent, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was my own ragged breathing. I thought it was over. But then, the shadows in the corners of the room began to shift. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. The fluorescent bulb overhead flickered slightly, casting uneven shadows across the walls. But as I watched, the shadows seemed to move on their own, stretching and twisting like they were alive. They crept toward the bed, slow and deliberate, pooling around Mrs. Crawford's body like ink spilling across the floor. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that room as possible, but I couldn't look away. The shadows climbed up the sides of the bed, curling around her limbs like tendrils. Her body began to sink into the mattress, the fabric of the hospital gown folding in on itself as if she were being pulled into some invisible void. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "No, no, no." But it didn't matter. Within seconds, she was gone. The bed was empty, the sheets crumpled, and her hospital gown was lying in the exact same spot where her body had been. The machines were still running, the ventilator still humming softly, but there was no one there. I backed out of the room, my heart racing, my mind spinning. 4 patients, 4 disappearances. And now I was sure of it. Whatever was happening in that hospital, it wasn't just a coincidence. When I got home after that shift, I couldn't stop shaking. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and sat on my couch with every light in the apartment turned on. Even then, I didn't feel safe. It was like that cold air from the hospital had followed me, sinking into my skin and refusing to let go. I didn't even bother trying to sleep. Instead, I opened my laptop and started searching for answers. I didn't know what I was looking for. Something about disappearances in hospitals maybe, or unexplained phenomena. But as I typed, my hands trembling over the keyboard, my thoughts kept drifting back to one thing: the night I was taken. It had been almost a year since it happened, but the memories were still vivid. I was driving home from a late shift, taking the back roads like I always did. The air was warm, the kind of humid summer night where the sky feels too big and too close at the same time. And then the lights appeared. At first, I thought it was a car behind me, but when I glanced in the rearview mirror, there was nothing there. Just two bright white lights floating in the darkness. They were too high to be headlights, too steady to be a plane. I pulled over, my heart pounding, and stepped out of the car. The lights were directly above me now, impossibly bright, so bright that they drowned out the stars. And then everything went silent. No crickets, no wind, not even the sound of my own breathing. Just silence. The next thing I remember is waking up in a field about a mile away from my car. My clothes were soaked with dew, and my skin felt raw, like I'd been standing in the sun for hours. I didn't know how much time had passed, but when I checked my phone, it was almost 3 hours later. I never told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? Even I wasn't sure I believed it. But after what I'd seen in the hospital, I couldn't ignore the similarities. The silence, the cold, the way the shadows moved. It all felt the same. I started digging deeper, searching for anything that could explain what was happening. I combed through old news articles, forums, even conspiracy theory websites. Most of it was nonsense, but then I stumbled across a story that stopped me cold. It was from 1987, about a hospital in a small town a few states over. Patients had been disappearing from the ICU, leaving behind empty beds and confused staff. The article didn't go into much detail, but it mentioned something about strange electrical malfunctions and unusual environmental conditions. The hospital had closed a few months later, citing financial difficulties. But in the comments section of the article, someone claimed to have worked there during the time of the disappearances. Their comment was short, just a single sentence, but it sent chills down my spine. They take the ones who are close to the end. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. My mind raced with questions. Who were they? Why were they taking people? And why now at my hospital? I didn't have answers, but one thing was clear. This wasn't random. The patients who disappeared were all on the brink of death, their bodies barely holding on. It was like they were being selected. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was connected to what had happened to me. The cold, the silence, the way time seemed to blur. It all felt too similar to be a coincidence. But what terrified me the most was the thought that maybe I wasn't just a witness to this. Maybe I was part of it. The next shift, I felt like I was walking into a trap. My gut churned with every step, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might leap out of my chest. Everything about the hospital felt sharper that night. The hum of the lights, the smell of antiseptic, the cold bite of the air that seemed to cling to me like a second skin. I kept replaying that comment in my head. They take the ones who are close to the end. It echoed over and over, refusing to fade, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. Was I really dealing with them? The same presence that took me that night? If that was the case, what did they want? And why the hospital? I didn't want to believe it, but my instincts told me otherwise. Every fiber of my being screamed that whatever was happening here was connected to the night I lost 3 hours of my life. I stuck to my rounds, keeping my head down and avoiding any place that felt wrong. But that night, it didn't matter where I went. The feeling was everywhere. It started around midnight. I was in the ICU again, checking vitals on a patient. It was a routine task, something I'd done 1,000 times before, but the moment I stepped into the room, I felt it. The air changed. It was subtle at first, like the faintest shift in pressure, but it grew stronger with each passing second. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and a deep, primal fear settled in my chest. I glanced at the monitor. The patient's vitals were normal, heart rate steady, oxygen levels stable. But something was wrong. I could feel it. And then I heard it. A faint hum, low and constant, vibrating through the walls and floor. It wasn't coming from the machines. It was deeper, almost like it was coming from inside my own head. I turned toward the corner of the room, and my breath caught in my throat. The shadows were moving. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe the flickering of the fluorescent bulb overhead. But as I watched, the shadows began to shift, stretching across the floor like they were alive. They crawled toward the bed, slow and deliberate, wrapping around the patient's legs and arms like tendrils. I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground, my body paralyzed by fear. All I could do was watch as the shadows climbed higher, swallowing the patient inch by inch. "Stop," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But the shadows didn't stop. They consumed the patient completely, pulling them into the darkness until there was nothing left. The bed was empty, the sheets crumpled, and the machines still running, their steady beeping the only sound in the room. I backed away, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. My mind was racing, struggling to process what I'd just seen. And then I felt it, the presence. It was the same feeling I'd had that night in the field, an overwhelming sense of being watched, of something impossibly vast and incomprehensible staring directly into my soul. I turned toward the doorway, and for a split second I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the shadows. Its body was humanoid but wrong, like it was stretched too far in places. Its skin was a pale, sickly gray, and its eyes, God, its eyes. They were black, endless voids that seemed to pull me in, drowning me in a sea of nothingness. I blinked, and it was gone. The room was empty, but the air was still heavy, the hum still vibrating in my chest. I stumbled out into the hallway, my legs shaking, my vision blurred with tears. I didn't stop moving until I reached the break room, where I collapsed into a chair, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I knew then, without a doubt, that this wasn't just my imagination. The disappearances, the shadows, the figure I'd seen, it was all real. And whatever was happening in that hospital, it wasn't done with me yet. I thought I'd seen the worst of it, but the hospital had other plans. After that night, I started noticing things that didn't make sense. Small, subtle details that I might have overlooked before. But now, after what I'd seen, every flicker, every strange noise, every malfunction felt like a warning. It started with the machines. I was doing rounds in the ICU, trying to keep my head down and act normal even though every fiber of my being was screaming at me to get out of there. I just finished checking on a patient when the heart monitor next to their bed started acting up. The beeping became erratic, skipping beats, then speeding up so fast it sounded like a constant tone. My first thought was that the patient was coding, but when I looked at the monitor, the readings didn't make sense. Their heart rate was bouncing wildly between numbers, 70 beats per minute, then 150, then back down to 30. Their oxygen levels were doing the same, dipping to dangerously low levels before spiking back up to normal. But when I looked at the patient, they were fine. Their breathing was steady, their color was normal, and there was no sign of distress. I tried resetting the monitor, thinking it might just be a glitch, but as soon as I powered it back on, the readings went haywire again. That's when the other monitors started doing the same thing. It wasn't just one room. The entire ICU was filled with the sound of alarms going off. Heart monitors, ventilators, infusion pumps, all beeping and flashing like they'd gone rogue. I ran to the nurses' station, my heart pounding, expecting to find everyone in a panic. But when I got there, no one seemed to notice. The other nurses were going about their routines like nothing was wrong. One of them, Carla, was chatting with a doctor about a patient's medication, her voice calm and steady. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. She glanced at me, frowning. "Hear what?" I stared at her, my mouth dry. "The alarms. All the machines are... They're fine," she said, cutting me off. "Everything's fine. You okay? You look pale." I wanted to scream. How could she not hear it? The noise was deafening, drilling into my skull like a hammer. But when I looked around again, I realized she wasn't lying. The machines were quiet. The alarms had stopped. I felt like I was losing my mind. For the rest of the shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every time I walked past a room, I felt a faint buzz in the air, like static electricity brushing against my skin. And whenever I checked a monitor, it would flicker, just for a second, before going back to normal. At one point, I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflection of a dark window. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing behind me, a tall, thin figure with black, empty eyes. But when I turned around, there was no one there. By the time my shift ended, I was a mess. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely clock out, and I had to sit in my car for 20 minutes before I felt calm enough to drive. But even as I drove home, the feeling didn't go away. The machines weren't malfunctioning. I knew that now. They were reacting to something. When I came back for my next shift, I realized something had changed. Not with the hospital, but with me. The nurses who used to wave or smile when I walked in were now avoiding eye contact. Carla, who'd always been chatty during our shifts, barely said 2 words to me. Even the doctors seemed colder, brushing me off whenever I tried to ask a question. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I was just paranoid after everything I'd seen. But as the hours ticked by, it became impossible to ignore. They were avoiding me. I'd catch them glancing in my direction when they thought I wasn't looking, whispering to each other when I walked past. The looks weren't just curious, they were suspicious, like I was the source of the strange things happening around us. By the time my break rolled around, I couldn't take it anymore. I cornered Carla in the break room, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is something going on?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She looked up from her coffee, her expression guarded. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, searching for the right words. "Everyone's been acting weird lately. Is it just me, or..." Carla shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "I don't know. Maybe people are just stressed. Things have been strange around here lately?" I nodded, trying to read her expression, but she wouldn't look at me. She finished her coffee and stood up, brushing past me without another word. I stared after her, my chest tightening. The isolation was suffocating. The more I tried to act normal, the more everyone seemed to pull away, leaving me alone to deal with whatever this was. But the worst part wasn't the cold shoulders or the whispered conversations. It was the growing feeling that the hospital itself was turning against me. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more spine-chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is pinned in the first comment, and even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey. The shift had been dragging on. Every second felt heavier than the last, each tick of the clock amplifying the tension in the air. The hospital was eerily quiet, more than usual, and the silence weighed on me like a stone. I had just finished checking a patient's vitals when I heard it. At first it was faint, almost indistinguishable from the constant hum of the hospital. But as I walked down the hallway, the sound grew louder, sharper. It wasn't coming from any of the rooms. It was coming from an empty supply closet at the far end of the wing. My instincts screamed at me to stay away, but something else, a mix of curiosity and dread, pulled me toward it. The closer I got, the stranger the sound became. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was more like a vibration, low and steady, resonating in my chest. I reached the closet and hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. The air around it felt colder, the chill seeping into my skin. My heart was pounding, every beat, echoing in my ears. Finally, I pushed the door open. Inside, the room was pitch black. The overhead light wasn't working, but the noise was louder now, almost deafening. I took a step inside, squinting to make out shapes in the darkness. That's when I saw it. In the center of the room, there was something unnatural. A faint shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising off pavement, except it was cold, bone-chillingly cold. The sound was coming from it, that low, vibrating hum that seemed to bypass my ears and go straight into my skull. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. And then, for a brief moment, the shimmer changed. It wasn't just a distortion in the air anymore. It was something else, something alive. I saw shapes, indistinct and shifting, almost humanoid but wrong. They flickered in and out of view, their forms blending into the shadows, their presence so overwhelming it made my knees buckle. One of them turned toward me, or at least I think it did. I couldn't see a face, but I felt its gaze, sharp and all-consuming. The hum grew louder, the vibration so strong now that the floor beneath me seemed to tremble. I felt a pressure in my chest, like the air was being sucked out of the room. And then it spoke, not with words, not in a way I could understand. It was a feeling, a thought pressed into my mind, foreign and alien. "You don't belong here." The words, or whatever they were, hit me like a physical blow. I staggered back, gasping for air, my vision blurring as tears streamed down my face. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, slamming the door behind me, the sound echoing down the empty hallway. But even as I fled, the hum stayed with me, vibrating in my chest, in my bones, like a part of it had followed me. I didn't go back to that part of the hospital for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep after that encounter. Even when I left the hospital at the end of my shift, I could still feel the hum vibrating in my chest. It was like a ghostly echo that refused to leave, no matter how far I tried to get from that supply closet. Once I got home, I knew I couldn't sit in silence. The fear, the tension, It was suffocating.
I needed answers, something to explain what was happening in that hospital. I decided to dig into the patient records. I know it wasn't exactly ethical. I could have gotten in Syria, phoned out, but at that point I didn't
Care. I had to know. I logged into the hospital system with shaky hands, my pulse racing as I searched for the names of the patients who had disappeared. Jameson, Green, Alvarez, and Crawford. At first I thought I'd hit a dead end. Their records were there, but they didn't show anything unusual. No unexplained notes, no discrepancies. It was like the hospital had just forgotten them. But then I noticed something odd. All 4 patients had been flagged in the system with a small icon I hadn't noticed before. A triangle with a line through it, like some kind of warning symbol. I clicked on it, and a new screen popped up. It wasn't part of the normal patient record system. This was something different, hidden deeper in the database. The screen was black with white text, and the language was clinical, almost detached. Patient flagged for end-stage observation. No intervention recommended. End-stage observation? I had never seen anything like that before. It wasn't part of our protocols, not anything I'd been trained on. I kept digging, searching for other patients with the same flag. There were dozens of them, all with similar notes. Terminal cases, patients on the brink of death. And just like the 4 I'd seen disappear, most of them were marked as no intervention. But what really made my blood run cold was the dates. The flagged cases went back years, decades even. The earliest ones were from the 1980s, the same time period as the article I'd found about the other hospital where patients had disappeared. I stared at the screen, my chest tight with fear. This wasn't a coincidence. Whatever was happening at my hospital wasn't new. It had been going on for years, maybe longer, hidden in plain sight. And somehow no one had noticed. Or maybe they had, and they were just too afraid to say anything. I thought about the words I'd heard in the supply closet. "You don't belong here." Were they meant for me? Or for the patients? And then a new thought struck me, one that made my stomach twist into knots. What if the hospital knew? What if the flags weren't just warnings, but permissions? I couldn't stop shaking. As I closed the laptop and sat back, staring blankly at the wall, the pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they painted was horrifying. This wasn't random. The patients weren't just disappearing, they were being taken. And the hospital was letting it happen. I couldn't shake what I'd discovered in the records. Every detail pointed to one undeniable fact. The hospital was complicit. Whether intentionally or not, it was enabling these disappearances. I needed to know more. I needed to see it happen again. That next shift, I came in with a plan. It wasn't a good plan. It wasn't even safe. But it was the only way I could think of to get answers. I was going to watch. There was a patient in room 219, a man named Mr. Whitaker. He was in his late 80s, bedridden with advanced SHIU, heart failure. The doctors had made it clear he didn't have long, and his chart had that same ominous triangle icon I'd seen before. He was flagged. I waited until the floor was quiet, just past 2 a.m., when most of the staff had retreated to the break room or were preoccupied with paperwork. I pulled a chair into the corner of Mr. Whitaker's room and sat down, keeping as still as I could. The room was dim, the only light coming from the monitor next to his bed. The steady beeping of his heart rate was the only sound, a rhythm that seemed to echo in the silence. For a long time, nothing happened. I started to doubt myself. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I'd scared myself into seeing patterns where there weren't any. I thought about leaving, about abandoning this whole idea before I got caught. And then, the air changed. It was subtle at first, like the faintest shift in pressure, but it quickly became oppressive. The room grew colder, and the shadows in. The corners seemed to deepen, stretching toward the bed. I held my breath, my hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly my knuckles turned white. The monitor began to beep erratically. Mr. Whitaker's heart rate spiked, then dropped, the numbers flickering wildly. His breathing grew shallow, his chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. And then he opened his eyes. They weren't like the others I'd seen. There was no black void, no unnatural glow, but they were wide, filled with a mix of fear and something else, resignation. It was like he knew. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I leaned forward, straining to catch what he was saying. "They're here." My blood ran cold. The monitor flatlined. A long, piercing tone filled the room as the shadows gathered around the bed, swirling like smoke. I wanted to move, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, watching helplessly as the shadows wrapped around Mr. Whitaker, pulling him down into the mattress. It was like watching someone sink into quicksand, their body disappearing inch by inch until there was nothing left. The hum started then, low and vibrating, filling the air like a physical force. It grew louder, stronger, until I thought my chest would cave in. And then it stopped. The room was silent. The bed was empty. The monitor still beeped faintly, as if nothing had happened. I stumbled out of the room, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. My mind was racing, trying to process what I'd just seen. They'd taken him. I didn't know who or what they were. But one thing was clear. They were real, and I had just witnessed them in action. After watching Mr. Whitaker disappear, I knew I couldn't stop now. As terrifying as it was, I needed to know more. I couldn't let this keep happening without understanding why. But the question that haunted me the most wasn't about the patients. It was about the hospital itself. How could this place, this building, allow something so unnatural to happen? The answer came to me when I was least expecting it. I was walking through one of the older wings of the hospital, a section that had been closed off years ago due to budget cuts. The air there was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and neglect. Most of the rooms were empty, their doors locked, the windows covered in a thin layer of grime. But as I turned a corner, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. There was a door at the end of the hallway. It wasn't like the others. This one was heavy, industrial, made of metal instead of wood. It didn't have a room number, just a small circular window near the top. I don't know what compelled me to approach it. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to get as far away as possible. But I couldn't. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The air around it was colder than anywhere else in the hospital, and I could feel a faint vibration under my feet, like the ground itself was humming. I looked through the window, but it was too dark to see anything on the other side. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. It was locked, of course. But as I turned to leave, my eyes caught something unusual, a keycard reader mounted on the wall beside the door. My mind raced. I didn't have clearance for this part of the hospital, but I'd seen plenty of doctors swipe their keycards around. If I could borrow one, just for a minute. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One of the doctors left their coat, draped over a chair near the break room. the corner of a key card poking out of the pocket. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. Taking it felt wrong, but I told myself I'd return it as soon as I was done. With the key card in hand, I made my way back to the door. My palms were slick with sweat as I swiped the card through the reader. There was a soft beep, followed by a metallic click. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase leading downward. The air was even colder here, and the hum I'd felt earlier was louder now, vibrating through the walls and floor. The stairs were narrow and steep, and the fluorescent lights flickered as I descended. At the bottom, I found myself in a large, empty room. The walls were made of concrete, unpainted and damp with condensation. In the center of the room was something I couldn't begin to explain. It looked like a machine, but it wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. It was massive, towering almost to the ceiling, with a circular structure at its center that pulsed faintly with an eerie bluish light. The hum was coming from it, growing louder the closer I got. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a storm, the air charged with static electricity. My hair stood on end and my chest tightened as I approached the machine. That's when I saw the doorway. It wasn't a doorway in the traditional sense. There was no frame, no physical structure. It was just there, a shimmering void suspended in the center of the machine. The edges were hazy, flickering like a mirage, and the inside was pure black. I stared at it, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. It wasn't just dark, it was nothingness. A void so complete it seemed to swallow the light around it. As I stood there, transfixed, I thought I saw movement within the void, shapes indistinct and fleeting, shifting just beyond the edge of perception. And then I heard it, a voice, faint and distorted, coming from somewhere deep inside the void. "Why are you here?" The words weren't spoken, they were in my mind, clear and overwhelming. My knees buckled and I fell to the ground, clutching my head as the voice continued. "This is not for you." I wanted to run, to get as far away as possible, but I couldn't move. The air around me felt heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. The shapes in the void grew clearer, more defined. I saw figures, tall and thin, their forms shifting and unnatural. They were watching me. The hum grew louder, turning into a deafening roar that made my vision blur. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The room was silent. The void was gone. I was alone. I don't remember how I made it back to the main floor. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in my car in the parking lot, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I couldn't go back, not after what I'd seen. I don't remember sleeping that night. Maybe I didn't. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, trying to piece together what I'd seen. The machine, the void, the voices. It felt like my mind was tearing itself apart, trying to make sense of it. The next day I avoided the hospital. I told them I was sick, but the truth was I was terrified. I couldn't face that place, not after what I'd seen in the basement. But staying home wasn't any better. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the memories. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. The void, the shapes moving inside, the way they seemed to watch me. And then, the voice. "This is not for you." It wasn't just words. It was a presence, vast and incomprehensible, pressing into my mind like it was peeling me open, layer by layer. I thought I was losing my grip. But then, something happened that made me realize it wasn't just in my head. It started with a dream, or at least I think it was a dream. I was back in the hospital, standing in the middle of a hallway. The lights were dim, flickering like they always did, and the air was cold, heavy with that same oppressive silence. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was like I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by an unseen force. Then, the shadows began to move. They crept along the walls and floor, stretching toward me like living things. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows gathered in front of me, twisting and writhing until they formed a shape. A figure, tall and thin, its body shifting and unnatural. It didn't have a face, not exactly. Its features were blurred, like I was seeing it through a layer of water. But its eyes were clear. Black, endless voids that seemed to pull me in, swallowing me whole. The voice came again, deep and resonant, vibrating through my entire being. You are not supposed to see. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. The figure raised a hand, or what looked like a hand, and pointed at me. And then I was falling. The floor disappeared beneath me, and I plunged into darkness. It wasn't just dark, it was absolute nothingness, a void, so complete it felt like it was devouring me. Shapes moved in the darkness, too fast and too fleeting to make out. I could feel them brushing against me, cold and alien, their touch sending waves of terror through my body. And then, I saw it. The machine. It was there in the void, its circular structure glowing faintly with that same bluish light. The hum was back, louder now, vibrating through my chest. The void around the machine seemed to ripple, and for a moment, I saw through it. I saw another place. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. The sky was a deep, endless black, and the ground was covered in jagged, metallic structures that glowed faintly with the same eerie blue light. Figures moved among the structures, tall, thin shapes that walked with an unnatural grace. They were the same as the ones I'd seen in the shadows, the same as the figure that had spoken to me. I felt their gaze on me, sharp and piercing, even though they were so far away. And then, one of them turned toward me. It reached out, its hand stretching impossibly far, and I felt its touch on my chest. The voice came again, louder this time, more forceful. You are not ready. I woke up gasping for air, my chest heaving as I struggled to breathe. My hands clutched at my shirt, and for a moment I was convinced I'd feel its touch still there, cold and alien. But there was nothing, just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room. I sat there for hours, my mind racing. This wasn't just a dream. It wasn't just my imagination. I'd seen something, and now it had seen me too. I knew I couldn't go back to the hospital, not after everything I'd seen, not after what had happened in the dream, or vision, or whatever it was. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even in the safety of my own home. But safety didn't feel like the right word anymore. The hum hadn't left me. It was quieter now, buried beneath the sounds of everyday life, but it was there, vibrating just at the edge of my awareness. Every time I stopped moving, stopped distracting myself, I could feel it again, faint but undeniable. I told myself I was done. I couldn't stay in that hospital another day. I didn't care about the paycheck or the questions I'd have to answer when I quit. My survival instinct had finally overridden my curiosity, But walking away wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. That morning, I tried to email my supervisor to let them know I wouldn't be coming back. But every time I typed the message, my hands would start shaking so badly I couldn't finish it. I don't know why, but I felt like leaving, truly leaving, would set something in motion, something I couldn't undo. I sat there staring at the screen, my chest tight, my fingers frozen over the keyboard. And then the lights flickered. It was subtle at first, just a quick dimming, but it happened again a few seconds later. And then again. The hum grew louder. My heart raced as I stood up, every nerve in my body screaming at me to move. But where? Where could I go that they wouldn't find me? A sharp, high-pitched whine filled the air and I stumbled back, clutching my ears. It wasn't coming from my laptop or my phone. It was coming from everywhere. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, dark tendrils creeping along the walls and floor. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I saw a shape emerging from the darkness, tall and thin with black, endless eyes. "No," I whispered, backing toward the door. "No, no, no." The air grew colder and the hum intensified, rattling through my chest. My breaths came in short, shallow gasps as I fumbled with the doorknob, my hands slick with sweat. Finally, I yanked the door open and ran. I don't remember much about that drive. I just remember getting into my car and flooring it, the engine roaring as I sped away from my apartment. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something. The city blurred around me, the familiar streets twisting into a chaotic maze. I didn't know where I was going, I just needed to get away. Eventually I found myself on the highway, the open road stretching out in front of me. The hum was quieter now, but it hadn't disappeared completely. It was still there, lingering in the background, like a faint echo. I drove for hours, the sun rising and falling as I put more and more distance between myself and the hospital. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The shadows seemed to shift at the edges of my vision, flickering in the corners of my eyes. Every time I glanced at the rearview mirror, I thought I saw something, a flash of movement, a dark figure standing in the distance. By the time I finally stopped, I was somewhere in the middle of nowhere, parked on the side of a desolate road. The sky was pitch black, the stars hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. I sat there in the driver's seat, my hands gripping the wheel, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. But for the first time in what felt like days, the hum was gone. I closed my eyes, leaning back against the seat as relief washed over me. And then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the window. My eyes snapped open and my heart stopped. There, standing just outside the car, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its body barely visible in the darkness, but its eyes were unmistakable. Black, endless voids that seemed to pull me in, drowning me in a sea of nothingness. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. And then the hum came back. It wasn't faint anymore. It was deafening, vibrating through the car, through my body, through my mind. I screamed, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the side of the road. The world was quiet, too quiet, and the air smelled of dirt and damp grass. My head throbbed and my body felt heavy, like I'd been drained of every ounce of strength. For a moment, I thought I was dead. The car was gone. My phone was gone. The only thing around me was the empty stretch of road, bordered by dense woods on either side. The sky was still dark, though I couldn't tell if it was night or the early hours before dawn. I tried to sit up, but my limbs wouldn't cooperate. My muscles ached like I'd been running for miles, and my chest felt tight, as if something had been pressing down on me. It took a few minutes before I could finally push myself to my feet. My legs wobbled beneath me, and I had to lean against a tree for support. The hum was gone. That was the first thing I noticed. The constant vibration that had followed me for days, maybe weeks, was finally silent. But the absence of it didn't bring relief. Instead, it left behind a hollow ache, like a part of me was missing. I stumbled down the road, my mind racing to make sense of what had happened. The last thing I remembered was the figure outside the car, its black, empty eyes staring into mine. After that, everything was a blur. Flashes of light, a sensation of falling, and then nothing. As I walked, fragments of the dream, no, the vision, came rushing back to me. The void, the machine, the figures moving in the darkness. The words echoed in my mind, clear and relentless. This is not for you. What did it mean? Why me? Why had they taken those patients, and why had they let me go? I didn't have answers, only more questions. But one thing was certain, I couldn't go back. Not to the hospital, not to my apartment, not to the life I'd had before. They had seen me, and I had seen them. I don't know how long I walked before I saw the lights. A small diner, its neon sign flickering in the distance like a beacon. My legs were trembling, and my vision was starting to blur, but I forced myself to keep moving. When I reached the diner, I pushed open the door and stumbled inside. The smell of coffee and greasy food hit me like a wave, grounding me in a way I didn't expect. The waitress behind the counter gave me a strange look as I collapsed into one of the booths. "You okay, hun?" she asked, her voice soft but wary. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt raw, and my mind was still racing, struggling to piece together the events of the last few hours. She placed a glass of water in front of me, and I drank it in shaky gulps, the cool liquid soothing my parched throat. "Been out here long?" she asked, sliding into the seat across from me. I shook my head. I don't know. Her brow furrowed, but she didn't press me for details. Instead, she gave me a small, understanding nod and went back behind the counter. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring blankly at the tabletop. My mind was a tangled mess of fear, confusion, and exhaustion. Eventually, I found the strength to stand. I paid for the water with the few crumpled bills I found in my pocket and walked back out into the night. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stop. The hum might have been gone, but I still felt their presence, lingering in the shadows, watching. And I knew deep down that this wasn't over. It's been months since I left the hospital, months since I last walked through those suffocating hallways, since I felt the weight of that hum vibrating in my chest, or saw the shadows move in ways they shouldn't, but no amount of time or distance has been enough to shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. I didn't tell anyone why I left. How could I? What was I supposed to say? That patients were vanishing into thin air, swallowed by shadows and an impossible machine, hidden in the bowels of the building? That I'd seen figures that weren't human? That I'd heard voices in my mind telling me I didn't belong? No one would believe me. Instead, I packed up what little I could carry and disappeared. I drove for days, stopping only to sleep, in cheap motels or eat at gas stations, trying to put as much distance as I could between myself and that place. I don't use my real name anymore. I don't stay in one place for long. I've learned to live with the fear, to keep moving and hope that they'll lose interest in me. But even now, I can't escape the memories. Every time I close my eyes, I see the void again. That endless, suffocating darkness. The machine, glowing faintly with its unnatural blue light. The figures moving within the shadows, watching me with those black, empty eyes. And the voice. This is not for you. Those words haunt me. I've replayed them over and over in my mind, trying to understand what they meant. Were they a warning, a threat, or something else entirely? Some nights I wake up drenched in sweat, convinced I can hear the hum again, faint and distant, just at the edge of my awareness. I tell myself it's not real, that it's just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know the truth. They let me go. I don't know why, but they did. And I can't shake the feeling that their mercy, or whatever it was, came with a price. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever truly be free. If I'll ever stop looking over my shoulder, waiting for the shadows to come alive again. I've thought about sharing my story, about warning others, but every time I try, the words catch in my throat. It's not just the fear of being dismissed as crazy. It's something else, something deeper. It's like a part of me knows that speaking about them, about the void, might draw their attention back to me. So I keep quiet. But if you're listening this, if you've made it this far, I need you to understand something. They're real, and they're still out there. Whatever is happening in those hospitals, it's not an accident. It's not a coincidence. It's a system. And if you ever find yourself in a place where the air feels too heavy, where the shadows seem to move when you're not looking, where the hum presses into your chest like a second heartbeat, leave. Don't wait. Don't ask questions. Just go. Because once they see you, once they mark you, it's only a matter of time, and not everyone gets to walk away. So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If you've had a similar experience or have suggestions for improving future videos, let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story.